An emancipatory movement is an effort or campaign to secure social rights, political rights, economic rights, or equality. A reactionary movement is an effort or campaign to reverse the results of an emancipatory movement and return society to its previous status quo. Although any political ideology can urge a return to a previous policy if the current policy is inadequate, reactionism is a specific tradition in right-wing politics, and emancipation is a specific tradition in left-wing politics. Reactionism, as the name suggests, is a response to either a successful emancipation or an ongoing emancipatory movement. Reactionaries engage in a counter-revolution against social change and social progress. For example, when a group that previously did not enjoy the same rights, privileges, or even recognition as the rest of society is finally granted those rights, privileges, and recognition, a reactionary movement can form to reverse their progress. A reactionary movement may also be opposed to the entirety of a new government following a revolution that gave new rights and privileges more broadly. Reactionary movements sometimes fail and sometimes succeed, but the success or failure of a reactionary movement is not exclusively binary. For example, the reactionary movement following the abolition of slavery in the United States certainly failed to reinstate chattel slavery, but still scored political victories that limited the rights of people of color and intimidated people of color into a de facto and sometimes de jure second-class citizenship. Though these definitions can sometimes be reductive, conservatism under most circumstances aims to maintain the status quo and resist emancipatory movements, whereas reactionism aims to essentially turn back the clock to an even more conservative society, a society before an emancipatory movement. Thus, reactionism is not separate from conservatism, but rather a specific movement within conservatism, with a conservative goal. A more right-wing, strictly hierarchical society based on whatever the reactionaries believe are traditional values or the way things ought to be. In the United States, as well as other Western nations, there are currently a series of emancipatory movements and a series of reactionary movements. The reactionary movements oppose, among other things, the recent interest in leftist politics among millennials and Zoomers, the recognition of transgender people, and police reform or abolition. These interrelated reactionary movements are controlled or urged by right-wing politicians, but are able to be mobilized by ordinary citizens. This is a serious topic and admittedly can be quite dry, as well as difficult to visualize because it happens partially through a form of social inertia instead of a conspiracy of the few. To better visualize this, an avatar of reactionism might be helpful in better understanding the beliefs, goals, attitudes, and rhetoric of a reactionary movement, and you probably know his name.
My name is Kid Rock!
Jesus Christ, is this what I'm doing this week? Okay. In his book, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Donald Trump, Professor Corey Robin described conservatism as the felt experience of having power, seeing it threatened, and trying to win it back. Conservatives in the midst of a reactionary movement see an egalitarian emancipatory movement as a threat to themselves, or the values that have come to define their worldview. Don't Tell Me How to Live will not be denounced as offensive here, no matter how much the musician believes everyone but himself is offended all the time. The song is, instead, telling about what makes conservatives feel threatened and defensive, and how they hope to portray that threat. Kid Rock makes several references that combine to form the thesis of the song. The United States is becoming soft, sensitive, feminine, and modern, and the nation should return to a time in an imagined past in which the nation was strong, insensitive, masculine, and traditional. The thesis is summarized like this.
Here's a situation, a nation of is our next generation.
It would appear that the devil without a cause has finally discovered his cause, reactionism. There is a common assertion in conservative circles that those who point out racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of bigotry are merely too sensitive, that recognizing either social or economic inequality is simply being offended. This framing of emancipatory movements as emotional, unreasonable, or offended benefits the conservative position because it dismisses their demands outright. The details of their demands need not even be acknowledged, because to conservatives, nobody is oppressed, only offended. This tactic is deceptive and ignorant, but highly effective. Conservatives often go with their gut to inform their politics, and consequently assume that anyone to their left is moved exclusively through instinct as well. Conservatives simply believe that their instincts are strong and correct, whereas other instincts are weak and incorrect. This is highlighted by Kid Rock's use of the infamous meme of a woman, Jessica Starr, crying at the Donald Trump inauguration in 2017. Conservatives love this image because it reinforces their belief about their instincts. They share the image, but almost never share her actual words that day. So here they are. I'm so sorry. I love people. This is not America. This is not what we want. There's no way to even comprehend what this means. Jessica Starr was not simply offended. She was concerned about the ramifications of a Trump presidency, the rise of far-right groups emboldened by his election, and the incompetence that he had displayed even before becoming president. She was concerned about a potentially catastrophic 4 years that many people would not survive. She was right to be deeply concerned, and everyone who said that people were overreacting to the potential danger was wrong. If the problem you have with her is how she expressed this concern, if your problem is with her tears, then maybe look inside yourself and determine why that is. Kid Rock repeats the purposefully deceptive conservative talking point that people are offended by opinions. This happens all the time in social media political discourse. Someone says something objectionable or proposes a dangerous policy, and when someone disagrees, that person says, "Oh, you're mad that I have an opinion, huh?" Of course, nobody is objecting to the existence of opinions or the right to have an opinion. They are disagreeing with the content of that particular opinion. Having an opinion does not make that opinion sacrosanct or immune to criticism. This deceptive rhetoric is similar to invoking the First Amendment of the United States Constitution when someone disagrees with an opinion. The constitutional right is not in question, only the content of the opinion. Unsurprisingly, Kid Rock makes this very argument in his song. Immediately following another line about people being offended, he says,
But this amendment one, it rings true. And if you don't dissent, to see number 2.
Okay, nothing like a just a joke incitement of political violence in the year 2021. Kid Rock's t-shirt reads, "Social media sucks," but nearly every dated 2017 conservative talking point used in this 2021 song was popularized on social media. Snowflakes, participation trophies, that meme. Without Twitter and Facebook misinformation, Kid Rock's God hero Donald Trump may have never been president of the United States. What Kid Rock is almost certainly alluding to is the myth in conservative circles that social media tends to favor liberal politics or leftist politics, and that social media more routinely censors conservative voices. Conservatives attempt to prove this using anecdotal data, but a wider data set and greater research shows something else altogether. Research from NYU and other institutions have proven that right-wing voices and institutions actually dominate social media by nearly every metric, and that policies on content moderation are made by a combination of foreign contractors and executives who see the political right as their biggest pool of customers, and are therefore committed to appease them, not censor them. Conservatives instead use particular instances of a conservative politician or public figure being banned to prove a pattern that does not exist. The most notable example they use is Donald Trump himself. However, Trump was not banned from Twitter and Facebook for being a conservative. He was banned for extremely serious violations and for using their platforms to incite violence. And it only seemed to happen because the employees had finally had enough and spoke to management. Too little too late, quite frankly. Twitter bans are not always judicious or correct, but the common denominator in political figures being banned or suspended is not party registration. It's terms of service violations. Conservatives do not see it that way, because when a conservative is banned for misinformation, their media propaganda has already told them ahead of time that the misinformation is actually true. Thus, it feels like their heroes are being censored for telling the truth when they are actually being banned for violating rules related to misinformation. The album cover is a clone of a copy of every political cartoon or t-shirt about the vague concept of liberty. Based on the context of Kid Rock's adolescent complaints, the artist is equating wearing a mask with the loss of liberty. However, the exact same image could be used to promote wearing a mask as our patriotic duty to one another. From Kid Rock's perspective, the Statue of Liberty wearing a mask is a tragedy, but without the context of his conservative politics, the messaging of the art can more easily be interpreted as pro-mask, not anti-mask. Remember, a reactionary movement is a counter-revolution, a movement with the aesthetic of revolution, but with a different objective. Kid Rock knows how to co-opt an aesthetic that is not his own. His entire career is based on the image of being a trailer park, blue-collar, salt-of-the-earth musician who came from nothing and speaks for the masses. Kid Rock, real name Robert James Ritchie, was raised by a wealthy family in a 5,660 square foot house with 5 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms. The property is on a 5-acre lot with a tennis court, swimming pool, and apple orchard. He is also not from Detroit, as his affluent neighborhood is approximately 40 miles away. Kid Rock supported Mitt Romney in 2012 and Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020, and he has admitted that he has done this primarily to protect his money. Kid Rock is an absolute phony delivering a phony message, using the aesthetic of the people and the aesthetic of revolution to paradoxically protect the status quo. Kid Rock is raging, but he is not raging against the machine. He is raging in favor of the machine. If there is still any doubt that Don't Tell Me How to Live is both conservative and reactionary, this next line should resolve that.
These minions and their agendas, every opinion has a millennial offended.
Here, Kid Rock connects offense to a generation. Now, we recognize that his usage of offense is a reductive reference to the demands of modern emancipatory movements, and he casts millennials as the movers of this emancipation. Thus, the conflict becomes generational. If the conflict is between generations, and Kid Rock has sided with the values of an older generation, then his unavoidable conclusion is that we must return to older values. And that is why the song is reactionary. Kid Rock's defenders might claim that the musician is not familiar enough with political theory to express a political belief, a defense that places his ignorance on a pedestal and employs the idiot defense in legal strategy. However, conservatives do not have to be professors of political science in order to have conservative beliefs. Lionel Trilling once wrote, "It is the plain fact that nowadays there are no conservative or reactionary ideas in general circulation. This does not mean, of course, that there is no impulse to conservatism or to reaction. Such impulses are certainly very strong, perhaps even stronger than most of us know, but the conservative impulse and the reactionary impulse do not, with some isolated and some ecclesiastical exceptions, express themselves in ideas, but only in action or in irritable mental gestures which seek to resemble ideas." In other words, Kid Rock's thesis is reactionary whether the musician is familiar with political theory or not. Let's stop listening to this ungodly track for one moment to dig a little deeper. What does the reactionary movement against the left and against modern emancipatory movements hope to accomplish? What are their goals? And why are their goals so important to them? The hierarchical mindset of conservatism casts freedom as a zero-sum game. If more people gain rights or even more consideration in society, conservatives conclude that their own freedom and status within society will be diminished. The saying goes, "When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression." Conservatives would naturally object to this characterization of their ideology, but the history of conservatism is the history of resisting these rights and considerations, then forming reactionary movements when all else fails. Conservatives obfuscate this pattern by claiming that everyone already is treated fairly, and that those within the emancipatory movement are actually asking for special privileges rather than equality. This allows conservatives to reframe the demands of the emancipatory movements as unreasonable no matter how reasonable the demands actually are. For example, transgender people face harassment, discrimination, violence, and other challenges on the basis of being trans that cisgender people do not face on the basis of being cis. A movement to bring attention to this and provide more considerations for these challenges is opposed by conservatives and by ignorant liberals. Their claim is that trans people are already treated well, thereby dismissing the emancipatory movement.
No one really, it doesn't seem to be, there's not a lot of overwhelming, overt discrimination against people who are trans, like publicly, other than the sports thing.
In truth, transgender people face enormous legal challenges. There are still no comprehensive federal non-discrimination laws that include gender identity for various public places and for housing. Furthermore, state legislatures are not only ignoring the lack of non-discrimination laws, but passing new discriminatory laws. State legislatures are passing more anti-trans laws than ever before. In 2021 alone, 7 anti-trans sports bans have passed in Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Montana, and West Virginia. 3 religious refusal bills have passed in Arkansas, Montana, and South Dakota. 2 anti-LGBT education bills have passed in Tennessee and Montana. An anti-trans health care ban passed in Arkansas. An anti-trans public bathroom bill passed in Tennessee. There is a lot more on the way, as more than 250 more bills have been introduced in state legislatures, and some of them are probably going to become law. In addition to legal challenges, trans people face so much harassment and have such a stigma tied to who they are that finding employment and housing can sometimes be difficult. 27% of trans people have been fired, not hired, or denied a promotion on the basis of being trans. This contributes to both a much higher poverty rate and much higher homelessness rate for trans people. Worse still, this is compounded by the fact that only 30% of women's shelters even allow trans women. Trans people are over 4 times more likely than cis people to be victims of violent crime. 35 out of 50 states still do not prohibit the trans panic defense in court, even in cases of murder. The majority of trans people have experienced intimate partner violence, and nearly half have been sexually assaulted. These combined obstacles and dangers contribute to a much higher suicide rate for trans people than average. There is so much data about the barriers that trans people face that any claim that they do not face significant challenges is absurd on its face. Conservatives pass anti-trans legislation and engage in anti-trans rhetoric, and at the same time tell people that anti-trans legislation and anti-trans rhetoric does not exist. It's important to note that not all transphobia comes exclusively from the right, but the reactionary movement against trans people is right-wing in ideology, regardless of the mere party registration or self-identification of those who inhabit it. Now, take this one example and apply it to any disenfranchised group throughout history or in modern times, and the pattern becomes clear. The emancipatory movement brings attention to the problem, conservatives claim that the problem either does not exist or has been exaggerated, the demands are described as special privileges instead of equality, and finally, conservatives engage in a reactionary movement guilt-free, because from this twisted perspective, they believe they are fighting for equality. This common refrain can be heard every time someone says, "It's easier to be a minority in this country," or "It's getting hard to be a straight white man." This is why conservatives want to believe that they are censored on social media, why they want to believe they are criticized for only having opinions. Because if oppression exists, and they themselves are not the oppressed people after all, then actual oppression could exist that would justify emancipatory movements. And conservatives just can't have that. Throughout the song and music video, Kid Rock takes care not to reference specific conservative causes. Instead, he uses conservative rhetoric and buzzwords to convey his message, thereby courting controversy to sell the song and express his politics without drawing attention from any particular group. Nevertheless, his undying support for Donald Trump and co-opting of right-wing memes and phrases makes his targets perfectly clear: every recent emancipatory movement of the past several years. His overuse of stale but infamous rhetoric and memes actually serves him well. Undoubtedly, those who agree with Kid Rock's vapid assertions may see any criticism of his video as evidence that he's right, that the left is too sensitive. Make no mistake here, Kid Rock made a purposefully inflammatory song in which his defensiveness borders on parody. When the targets of his shallow observations point this out, he will do what every other incurious ne'er-do-well does when his argument collapses. He will distill his political discourse into a game of "you mad?" and claim victory without the presence of a contest. His juvenile libretto about how everyone else is too emotional is the language of reactionaries. Nobody is triggered by Kid Rock's outdated references to participation trophies, and nobody is fooled by his pretense of bringing people together amid his caterwauling divisiveness. Kid Rock wants his audience to believe that everyone else is angry but himself, even as he rap rocks a thinly veiled incitement of violence. Kid Rock, on the off chance that you ever watch this, I will tell you the same thing that I used to tell my students when they misbehaved. I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed.